The snow began its descent like a secret slowly spilled. No fanfare, just a whispering hush over the land, as if nature itself held its breath for the long night ahead. Out on the American frontier in the late 1800s, this hush was not just poetic, it was slightly terrifying. Because when that first flake fell, tiny and innocent, every covered wagon occupant knew they were on borrowed time and borrowed firewood. The covered wagon, that famously bouncy chariot of dreams, was not exactly built for winter. Comfort ranked somewhere near the back of the priority list, right behind don't tip over in a creek, and try not to get eaten by a bear. For most families, it was a wooden wagon box with a canvas top stretched over a rib cage of wooden bows, like a fragile tortoise shell pulled by oxen with strong morals and poor navigation skills. Inside, the situation wasn't exactly cozy. If you're imagining flannel blankets and a crackling fireplace, I regret to inform you those belong to Charles Dickens, not Charles Wagonman. Frontier folks wrapped themselves in quilts as stiff as pancakes, layering everything from buffalo hides to patched up wool trousers over their chattering knees. Creative among them even repurposed dried apple sacks into makeshift socks. Nights during a blizzard were the longest part of the day by a comfortable margin. As the wind howled across the plains like a jury of wolves, families would huddle in the center of the wagon. The romantic ideal of the wide, open wild was sharply undermined by a sibling's cold feet pressed against your side and the smell of boiled turnips lingering in a confined space with nowhere to escape. They cooked over little iron stoves when lucky enough to have one. Otherwise, it was the great experiment of cooking over a fire too small and snow too large. This, combined with the fragile rationing of whatever was left in the flour sack, meant that meals often included things like hot water with salt or biscuit-shaped mystery. Porridge, that damp friend of frigid times, always made its appearance, if not by choice, then by inevitable oat invasion. It stretched across time and tolerance like a culinary frontier ghost. Forget Netflix. Entertainment was whoever could tell the best story without falling asleep in the middle of it. Tales of the old country, of river crossings, of ghostly lanterns seen in distant forests. Slightly alarming content for children trying to sleep in a creaky mobile box surrounded by pitch darkness, but it kept their minds from wondering how permanent snow blindness might actually be. And still, remarkably, there was peace in it all, a kind of camaraderie that only forms when you're collectively wearing every shirt you own. The noises of the night, the groan of the wagon wood, the snap of frost forming on leather boots, the occasional startled snore, became a lullaby. Oxen stood like brown statues nearby, snow collecting gently on their backs, stalwart companions who neither judged nor offered helpful opinions. Beyond the fabric flaps of the wagon cover, the prairie stretched on forever. Underneath the thick blanket of snow, seeds slept. Rabbits huddled deep in their burrows, and trees gave up their bending battles with wind for the simple dignity of swaying. It was winter, and the world had temporarily shut its eyes. Somewhere along the Oregon Trail, or the Mormon Trail, or the Santa Fe, you'd find fires flickering out, shovels standing in the snow like sentries, a woman grinding what remained of last summer's corn between two rocks, a child playing with a button tied to a string, and a man trying, without much success, to chase warmth back into his hands by rubbing them together like he was making a wish. But they believed in where they were going, even if they couldn't see more than a foot past the wagon wheel. That kind of quiet bravery hums softly, even through the loudest blizzards. It's written in the frost that gathered on old boots and in the steam that rose from a mismatched tin mug in the dark. If these stories help you drift off, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world to me. And before you fully fade into dreamland, I would love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now, curl a little deeper into your blankets. The snow is falling heavier now, and the wind is whispering old tales through the fabric of the wagon walls. Tomorrow is another morning. If the porridge doesn't bite first. The wind howled across the vast plains like a hungry ghost wearing a buffalo skin. It raked at wagon canvas and whispered unsettling things through the chinks in the wooden wheels. Somewhere deep inside the covered wagons of the westward bound, a cook stove wheezed its last ember, and someone tried without success to remember what their toes felt like. The year was 1849, golden for some, heavy for most, and though many had dreams shimmering in their heads like prospectors' pans, what they mostly had was frostbitten livestock and a whole lot of regrets stuffed under buffalo robes. In one particularly rickety wagon sat the Grisby family, a gaggle of moderately hopeful pioneers who had left behind a decent root cellar in Ohio in exchange for the promise of better soil, and an inexplicably persistent rumor that California had taverns with golden chandeliers. The only gold the Grisby wagon carried, however, was in the form of Matilda Grisby's molasses cornbread, which had accidentally caramelized into something resembling a mineral. It was the third week of snowstorms, and silence blanketed the camp like a poorly mended quilt. You could hear the horses' breaths turn to steam and crackle against the chilly air. The oxen stared mournfully into the distance, as though recalling better days of summer pastures and not, say, pulling a mobile wooden house into a snowbank. Inside the Grisby wagon, little Hannah was snuggled beneath a mountain of patchwork blankets, each stitched with a family memory. Uncle Jed's old pants, the baby's first flannel gown, and one suspicious square that looked a lot like the gingham curtains from their old pantry window. Hannah's breath fogged against the oilskin window as she whispered a quiet prayer to the stars, half thank you, half negotiation. The candles had been extinguished early to conserve wax. Mrs. Grisby, ever the moral pillar and unintended comic relief, had suggested everyone say something they were grateful for before falling asleep. Predictably, Tom Grisby, age 13, and in the rude prime of sarcasm said, "I'm grateful for not being eaten by wolves yet." Mr. Grisby had chuckled, which meant disciplinary action was postponed until morning. Outside, the snow hissed and fell, not in graceful flurries, but in insultingly large clumps. If snow had a mood, this snow's was deeply passive-aggressive. It crept into seams. It weighed down the canvas until the ribs of the wagon sagged like old men at church. It swallowed boot prints almost as soon as they formed, a sort of natural commentary on the futility of waking up early to hunt for firewood. Many settlers believed they had prepared for such nights. They had packed quinine, hardtack, spare axe handles, and optimism, the last of which, regretfully, proved difficult to burn. Firewood, on the other hand, had been swiftly reduced to whatever could be spared. Chair legs, fence stakes, and occasionally someone's copy of the Book of Mormon or Walden, depending on which direction their philosophical compass pointed. The communal fire pit, now a shallow crater of ash and minor ambition, stood in the middle of the camp circle. No one visited it any more except for old Mrs. Penfeld, who came once a day to poke it like a suspicious pie crust and mutter, In such weather, survival strategies became inventive. One man tried crawling into his bedroll with a chicken. He was successful, But the chicken was not amused. Another swore by bear grease foot wraps. Whether he ever found the bear is not recorded, but his feet reportedly developed a shiny luster admired by several nearby camps. The pioneers had dozens of ways to describe the cold. Bitter as a banker, colder than a well-digger's handshake, and enough to freeze the whiskers on a minister's nose were just a few. But the kind of cold that settled on those nights wasn't showy. It was the quiet kind of cold. The kind that didn't knock you down, but instead gently reminded you all night long of how very thin your mittens were. Back in the Grisby wagon, someone, possibly a dreamer, had begun humming a tune. It was off-key and uncertain, but familiar. Shenandoah, maybe, or something that had started as a hymn and wandered over to become a lullaby. The sound floated over the sleeping figures and mingled with the wind which, having failed to terrify anyone, effectively that evening, considered moving on to the next campsite. And so, the night wore on. Stars blinked their slow, indifferent approval overhead. The blizzard thickened, and beneath a patchwork sky of cloth and snow, the wagons creaked, shivered, and waited quietly for the first hint of light. The wind had a talent for making itself known, not with a scream, but with a long, low sigh, as though the prairie itself was remembering something it never liked to talk about. Inside the wagon, the oil lamp flickered against the canvas walls, painting slow-moving ghosts of wooden beams and iron pots. Outside, the sky had tucked itself into a thick grey quilt of snow clouds, determined to fling flakes at anything with the audacity to exist. The Caraway family had never been what you'd call seasoned travellers. Before this great westward migration, the most nomadic any of them had been was Uncle Amos, and even he had only moved across the road to get nearer the town's only tavern. But now, here they were, somewhere just east of nowhere, somewhere west of where their map stopped offering any constructive advice, huddled in a creaking wooden box on wheels, lightly buried beneath layers of drifting snow. It wasn't a fierce blizzard, not yet. More of a preamble storm. The snow hadn't turned outright rude. It was still in that passive-aggressive stage where it pretends to be beautiful while quietly immobilizing your oxen. But even this first act of winter theatre had a way of curling around one's ribs and whispering, "Hope you're not counting on your fingers functioning much longer." Ellie Caraway sat near the back of the wagon, her hands wrapped around a tin mug of something politely pretending to be coffee. It was made from scorched chicory root and vague optimism. Her little brother Thomas was already snoring under a mound of patchwork blankets stitched over 3 winters by a well-meaning but easily distracted aunt. Indeed, one square bore the initials JW, and no one had ever figured out who JW was. "Ma," Ellie whispered, watching the canvas ripple with the wind's cold breath. "Do you think the storm's getting worse?" Hazel Caraway didn't answer right away. She was knitting, or at least performing movements that, in better lit circumstances, might have resolved into knitting. "Hard to say," she murmured, her spectacles sliding down her nose in slow, philosophical protest. "It's got the sound of a storm playing coy, the kind that likes to flirt with your sanity before it really commits." Hazel was from Missouri, but I had inherited the hard-nosed practicality of someone from considerably further north, or possibly just someone who had once forgotten to close the chicken coop before a hailstorm. You'd think that, by now, folks would have figured out how to outwit the weather. But in the 1800s, meteorology was still considered a polite form of guesswork. If a farmer's rheumatism was acting up, that was as good as a barometer. And if your ox sneezed 3 times in a row, cancel your plans. Snow's coming. Back east, towns had church bells and schoolhouses. They had roof shingles. Out here, life was held together with rope, stubbornness, and a strong moral suspicion of comfort. Out here, bedtime stories were less about princes and more about how Pa survived the winter of '38, when the soup froze solid in the pot. Not precisely a fairy tale, but wildly effective at making children finish their turn at firewood chopping. But despite the conditions, and despite the rattling worry of frost creeping into their boots, there was a curious kind of peace. The kind that only settles in when your body's done all the work it can do for the day, and your heart still thumping along in its stubborn frontier rhythm. They hadn't made it far, but they had made it this far. And out here, this far, was close enough to somewhere. Ellie leaned back, letting her cheek rest against the side of the wagon. The canvas was icy cold, but solid. You had to trust the walls, even when they were made of wood, fabric, and prayer. She could hear the snow hissing against the wheel spokes outside, and the low, phlegmy cough of their ox, Barnaby, who was tucked just beyond the wagon's cover like a moody saint. Ma's knitting clicked softly as the fire dimmed to coals. Somewhere, an owl hooted, which modern listeners might call whimsical. But to 19th century ears, it was a noise not unlike a tax collector arriving in the dark. Ellie closed her eyes and tried to picture home, though home was no longer a place, but a direction. And they were following it still, cold step by cold step. The snow would keep falling. The wind would keep wondering why anyone had tried to cross this land in December. And somewhere ahead, just beyond the reach of their firelight, was the promise of morning. Or wolves, but probably morning. And with any luck, a small miracle of warmth waiting just over the horizon. Winter had a way of clearing its throat around supper time. A sudden hush would fall across the prairie, as if even the wind had the decency to pause before its final biting performance. On particularly ambitious nights, the temperature sank low enough to make tin soup bowls sing when touched. Small curls of breath coiled from mouths and noses, slow, ghost-like, and rather sassy in the way they refused to vanish for a good few seconds. The covered wagon, in all its wooden canvas-top nobility, had never aspired to be warm. It wasn't designed for comfort. It was essentially a crib on wheels for grown-ups with dangerous levels of optimism. On chilly nights, the canvas top picked up sounds in a strange, echoey fashion, like it was trying to be polite about the wind's insults, but couldn't help repeating them in a whisper. The fabric fluttered and snapped like a distracted librarian swatting at flies. Inside, 6 souls squeezed together, under blankets stuffed with whatever passed for fluff in 1843, buffalo hair, whittled hope, and probably a fair bit of leftover laundry lint. Mercy Alcott, newly 13 and already excellent at rolling her eyes in the dark, scowled with professional flair as her brother's foot jabbed her in the spine for the 3rd time. "You snore like you swallowed a harmonica," she whispered fiercely. "I wish I owned a harmonica," Moses murmured sleepily, never once opening his eyes. Then this trip wouldn't be such a long silence. Their father, Chester Alcott, let out a soft chuckle from his end of the pile, a man-shaped pile wrapped in a flannel coat that still somehow smelled like axle grease and church pews. "You'll miss the silence when the Oregon bugs start serenading you," he said. "Sounds like a fiddle fight between mosquitoes and banshees." Chester had a way of painting vivid, if slightly alarming, pictures. He'd been reading old guidebooks to the Oregon Territory, books penned by enterprising men who likely never went west of Cincinnati, but wrote with great confidence about rivers as gentle as baby's breath and forests tailor-made for good Christian lumbering. Chester had started reading these out loud at night, partly for entertainment and partly out of spite against the wind. This evening's passage came from a guide called Delaney's Directives for the Sensible Sojourner, published in 1839 and bound in what appeared to be some combination of leather and disapproval. When encountering buffalo, Chester read aloud in his even voice, "One must remain calm and upright. The buffalo respects confidence." "Do they respect open weeping?" asked Mercy, burrowing deeper under the quilt. "I respect open weeping," muttered their younger sister Letty, curled up like a comma in the corner. "But only if it's artistic." The wind howled in reply. Not a practical howl, mind you, but a decorative one, arched just right over the canvas, lingering at the wagon's seams, ruffling through the canvas ties like a curious raccoon. Snow had started to drift in from tiny gaps, a steady trickle of prairie dandruff finding its way to the skin. Their mother, quiet and efficient as ever, secured another layer over the back flap with hands that had mended more wagon wheels than most men. Her name was Hester, and she wielded buttons with the deadly speed of a fur trader's musket. If she ever ran out of linen, it was said she could patch things with sheer domestic authority. "We'll wake up warm, or at least alive," she announced lightly, tying the flap shut with a twist and a nod. Warmth was not expected. Aliveness, while desired, was not guaranteed either. Outside, the oxen exhaled slow clouds of steam in their pens, hooves crunching softly under straw stolen from 3 abandoned barns and a highly negotiable deal with an off-brand Missouri innkeeper. They still wore their harnesses, partly because it saved time, and mostly because no one had the heart to untangle all the straps again. The night deepened, snow thickened, stars blinked behind a shifting gauze of clouds, as if eavesdropping politely. Mercy, now forcibly spooning her sister for survival, finally whispered, "Do you think people in cities ever freeze like this?" "Only when the ballroom ran out of firewood," Chester said sleepily, "or when the gossip chilled the air so hard it cracked the teacups." A light titter rippled through the children before dissolving into the soft hush of breath and wind. The fire outside had long faded to embers, but inside, stories hovered gently between eyelids and dreams, stitched together with prairie wind and the quiet, unreasonable hope that tomorrow's road might hold a hill, a prairie dog, or at least a moment of sun warm enough to remember. Somewhere in the dark, a coyote called, not a threat, just a note, and the wagon slept on, creaking in its exhale. Tomorrow, they'd face frozen boots and forgotten spoons. But tonight, they had canvas, quiet, and a sky full of muttering stars. Eventually, the wind settled down and the snow leaned in, and all that was left was the soft hum of warmth being imagined, one breath at a time. As morning crept nearer, wrapped in frost and fiddles, it was the sort of wind that didn't whistle so much as it sighed. Long, cold breaths across the high plains, as though the prairie itself were unsettled by the clouds gathering like quiet conspirators above. Joel Thompson braced against it, his coat flapping against him like a half-tied apron on laundry day. He had paused by the wagon wheel, ostensibly to check the axle, but mostly to pretend he didn't hear his wife Martha, reminding him for the 15th time that snow was definitely coming. And she was right. Martha was always right in the manner of wives who had endured 3 winters in a leaky sod house and still retained the will, to politely say, "I told you so," when your boots froze standing up by the stove. The covered wagon, that noble wooden whale of American land voyaging, creaked under the weight of its canvas shell and humanity within. 2 children and 1 pinewood rocking chair occupied the back with roughly equal stubbornness. The chair, incidentally, had insisted on coming along from Ohio, despite its lack of legs on one side and general aura of splintered doom, because, as Martha said, it's where my father read his Bible. The children had far less honorable reasons for coming, being born and thus difficult to leave behind. Joel straightened and peered toward the horizon, where the light had turned a color best described as lantern before it goes out, the sort of foreboding shade that made your hat feel less like fashion and more like insulation. He knew, in the quiet resignation that defined most 19th century decision-making, that they'd be stopping soon. "Better pull off," he said to no one in particular, perhaps to the ghost of some ox driver past. "A night like this'll put ice in a man's beard and second thoughts in his bones." And so, with the groaning diplomacy of tired livestock and frost-bitten wheels, the wagon eased to a stop off the faint track that was technically a road. Technically, in the same sense that their coffee was technically made from beans, burned beans, that had been used twice before. Inside the wagon, the children were already cocooning themselves in a nest of quilts and wide-eyed questions. "What if the snow gets in, Papa?" asked the small one, his head emerging from wool like a groundhog of existential dread. "Well, then it gets to hear your ma snore," Joel replied, with affectionate sacrilege. Martha, having already begun laying out dry biscuits and cold sass, ignored him with expert efficiency. She was busy wrapping tallow candles in muslin against the chill. They were roughly 5 days behind schedule now, which in covered wagon terms was entirely on time. Journeys back then flowed not by hours, but by axle grease and the resilience of mules. And one did not push ahead in a snowstorm unless one desired the company of frozen cartographers drawing angels in the drifts. Joel climbed into the wagon last, pulling the flap closed against the wind. It thunked shut with a sound just shy of finality. A few muffled adjustments, some elbow jabs, over wool real estate, and then stillness. The uncomfortable, blanket-rustling, elbow-scratching stillness of a wagon settling in for a long winter's nap. Out in the night, the snow began in earnest. Not in dramatic flakes like you might find in a painting at a ski lodge, but in a slow, persistent drift. The sort of snow that finds its way into your socks, your soup, and eventually your soul. They say you can hear snow falling if everything else goes quiet. And on these frozen plains, it did. The sound was like thousands of tiny secrets being whispered onto the earth, covering broken wagon ruts and lost mittens with equal mercy. The sort of hush that reminded you the world was very, very wide, and you had chosen, for reasons now lost to memory, to cross it in a glorified shed on wheels. Martha struck a match, illuminating the dim canvas interior in flickering amber. The children's faces glowed for a moment, then faded to silhouettes beneath the blankets, heads resting on bundles of cornmeal and makeshift pillows likely filled with chicken feathers and denial. Joel leaned against the sideboard, his breath curled before him. He thought, maybe, of Ohio, and how warm the summers had been, and how cold the winters had also been, and how migration often feels like trading one set of discomforts for another, dressed up in the noble garb of manifest destiny. Outside, the snow deepened. Inside, sleep settled in like a neighbor you didn't invite, but who brought pie anyway. And somewhere, not far off, a soft howl, echoed. Coyote, likely. Unless it was the sound of another family bedding down just over the ridge, out of sight, dealing with identical worries and equally lumpy bedding. The wind pressed gently at the canvas walls as if testing the fabric's resolve. But the fire in Martha's little lantern held fast, and for now, so did they. The snow had turned to a whispering hush, coiling between the wagon wheels and sighing against the wooden slats. Out on the plains, the wind no longer howled. It spoke in lullabies, the kind only wild land and tired creatures understand. The fire inside the ring of wagons had been banked low, glowing like a sleepy eye beneath a blanket of ash, and everyone under its gentle light looked more like bundled up potatoes than pioneers, each wrapped in quilts, furs, and stitched up dreams of better weather. That night, inside the McCallan family's wagon, a miracle was taking place. Little Thomas was asleep without asking 14 questions about buffaloes. Mrs. McCallan exhaled slowly and closed her eyes, knowing such peace was rarer than a warm biscuit on a cold morning. Mr. McCallan, meanwhile, whispered to himself as he counted their remaining candles, a nightly ritual which historians never mention but surely happened, because rationing your only source of affordable lighting tends to consume the mind. By now, survivors of 4 snowdrifts and 1 dramatic pitching of a wagon, due to a tantrum-prone ox named Liberty, the travellers had begun to resign themselves to the quiet theatre of winter life. Chores were completed with stiff fingers and loud sighs. Supper was a ceremony of soup, muttered prayers, and the committed chewing of things labelled hardtack that were technically edible, though mostly out of tradition. In the stillness of evening, it was common for conversations to drift towards subjects like, "What do you miss the most?" and "Do you think the cow understands it's Tuesday?" Comfort came in uncanny ways. The Smith family, for instance, found a strange satisfaction in reading aloud the Sears, Roebuck & Co. catalogue, page by page, item by item, imagining what a life might feel like with a new copper kettle or those fanciful, overly optimistic egg beaters with the tiny gears. The power of imagination, after all, is stronger when your boots are frozen solid and your coffee tastes like yesterday's sock water. In many wagons, the usual bedtime entertainment involved someone with a decent singing voice and an indecent knowledge of folk songs. These could range from ballads of lonesome prairie lads to humorously slanderous tunes about rival towns. The Little Twins, 14, musically inclined and absolutely dreadful at harmonizing, refused to let a single night pass without attempting Sweet Prairie Rose, which might have been touching if it didn't sound like coyotes arguing over a sandwich. The fear of the blizzard was never bravely discussed, not really. Instead, it crept in quietly, in the way people triple-checked the shutter hook on the wagon flaps, in the way they hugged the stove at midday and shook out every blanket in the known universe before sleep. Strong men grew particularly fond of talking about bear attacks, since it was somehow less chilling than discussing wind so cold it made your teeth ache in your dreams. But some, like old Mrs. Crenshaw, who had once tried to marry a doctor purely for his medical trunk, took such nights as an opportunity. With her copper hair now white and a spine she swore was held together by stubbornness and goose grease, she called the little ones to her wagon and told stories. Not all true, of course, and not meant to be. Her version of George Washington involved him befriending a clever raccoon, and she insisted the Louisiana Purchase was finalized because Napoleon lost a bet involving hot pepper stew. It was perhaps the kindness of this deceit that made it easier to believe come morning. The children slept easier for it. and the adults let the laughter unstick their joints. Even those who didn't believe a word of it leaned close when she spoke, if only to remember what comfort sounded like. Outside, the snow continued its secret work. It tucked the wagon train in carefully, pressing smooth white shapes against the canvas edges and quieting even the air. Hooves muffled, wind gentle, and stars hidden above the clouds, the world became almost sacred in its silence. And somewhere along the frozen river, one of the oxen, probably Liberty, attempted to lie down in a position not recommended by anatomy, inspiring mild chaos and one moderately heroic rescue. Back in the wagons, the fire burned low, the stories dwindled, and sleepy dreams began to rise like mist off a warm skillet. Tomorrow, the snow would deepen, and survival would stir again. But just for now, the prairie listened to hearts slowing down, to teeth-clattering songs turned to snores, and to the hush of a history too, quiet to be remembered. Except in moments like this, let's stay a little longer, where the hush holds us tightly, and drift gently forward as the wind moves once again. The wind had taken up fiddling again. It slipped through the seams of the wagon like a wayward ghost, softly rasping over canvas and creaking through the wooden bones of the frame. Each gust rolled in low and slow, drawing long sighs from the prairie beyond, as if the land itself was not overly fond of winter's theatrics. Inside the wagon, things had settled into their usual traveling night hush. An oil lantern hissed in protest against the cold, casting a sleepy amber glow over quilts stitched by calloused hands, a kettle clinging to the last of its warmth, and the curled-up figure of young Eliza, whose breath made tiny clouds as she snored gently into a tattered pillow fashioned from an old flour sack. Thomas, her father, sat hunched on a stool just outside the flap, wrapped in a buffalo hide coat that had once belonged to a trapper named Henry, who'd lost it in a card game in Fort Laramie, and likely his dignity too, though that had not been wagered officially. Between his chapped fingers, Thomas cradled a tin mug of something attempting to resemble coffee. In truth, it was a brewmaster's disgrace, charred chicory root and sorrow boiled into a drinkable broth, which at least had the decency to be hot. The stars flickered above him, sharp and watchful, like the eyes of judgmental churchgoers. The sky wore winter full and heavy, a vast quilt of grey and black with patches of frost that glinted when the cloud curtain parted. Somewhere out there, in that snow-leaden dome, coyotes discussed territorial boundaries in falsetto, and the snow continued its quiet conversation with the world. Back inside, Martha was rubbing salve into little Caleb's frostbitten toes, narrating the process in a sing-song voice that tried hard not to betray the worry nesting behind her spectacles. She was using a mix of bear grease and pine resin, an old remedy passed down from someone's great someone, whose medical credentials were probably just a spectacular beard. Now these toes, she muttered, seem determined to become icicles, don't they? Caleb, half asleep and already dreaming of stuffing snow into his sister's boots at first light, murmured something about mashed potatoes. Martha raised one eyebrow. Mashed toes, more like. Meanwhile, over in a darker corner of the wagon, Grandfather Edwin snored with the deep, confident gusto of a man who had once slept through cannon fire during the War of 1812 and figured no weather could out-racket British artillery. His boots twitched each time the wind howled, a reflex developed back when wolves howling had sometimes been less metaphorical and more, well, canine. The fire outside had waned to a red-nosed glow, smothered beneath shovelfuls of snowbanked protection. Nothing but coals and memory left. A whisper of smoke still curling lazily, like a Victorian lady's fan, gesturing politely toward the business of survival. All across the camp, other wagons huddled together like tired beasts too cold to bicker. Canvas flaps flapped occasionally. Metal horseshoes chimed as draft horses shifted in their sleep. And above all else, the snow fell, softly, steadily, endlessly. There is a peculiar sort of beauty in that kind of winter quiet. It makes you listen harder, listen deeper. You hear things tucked into silence. The squeal of a leather strap tightening as the cold shrinks it, the satisfied crunch of snow settling under its own weight, the far-off snap of a tree limb giving up its struggle with heavy frost. These were the sounds of prairie lullabies, but this quiet, let us not be fooled, was a quiet made by caution. The settlers knew better than to trust anything too peaceful. The plains were like an old cow. They might seem docile, chewing cud under a blue sky, but they could kick like the devil when spooked. And winter was nothing if not a season of mischief and irony. Just days before, the family had passed a trail marker hacked into an ancient cottonwood tree with the words "Turn Back" carved in a shaky hand, question mark and all. Somewhere out west, someone's boots had indeed turned back. The children hadn't seen it. Thomas had made certain of that. Children had enough to worry about without knowing that even trees were becoming sarcastic. Now, as the lantern's flame drew slow shadows against the canvas and the frost crawled like delicate lace over the windows of this wheeled cocoon, the night exhaled once more, deep and wide, wrapping the landscape in stillness one could almost hear. If you leaned close, you might hear something else too. The rumble of a storm rolling toward them from the north, too distant to worry them yet, but too large to ignore for long. In the morning, the frost would tell a new story on the ground, and the tracks would lead to choices yet muddied by snow and silence. By the pale blue hush of morning, icy lace clung to the wagon canvas like a timid squirrel holding onto a curtain. The frost had drawn delicate ferns along the inside of the wheels, and even the oxen's breath rose in lazy steam clouds, as if they too were reluctant to acknowledge the existence of another day lost to snow. Inside the wagon, hung thick with the perfume of damp wool and yesterday's baked onions, Eliza Wilkins was attempting the delicate negotiation of cold fingers into a pair of gloves that had frozen into the shape of lobster claws. Beside her, Amos was engaged in his personal morning ritual, glaring at a corner of the wagon's wooden bench and muttering about who's been pilfering the corned beef rations again, as if a band of phantom picnic bandits had slipped through the canvas overnight and made off with the last slab. There was no corned beef, of course, just the distant memory of it somewhere back in Missouri, where the snow didn't fall like celestial flour from an angry baker's apron. Outside, the snow had developed what frontiers folk might describe as a personality. It no longer lay still. It shifted silently in drifts, curled like wolves around wheels and boots, and settled into every crevice of the world with the smug authority of cold royalty. One couldn't just walk through it. One had to trudge, that most poetic of settler verbs. And trudge they did. Bundles of humanity emerged from wagons like sleepy puffins, cloaked in every scrap of fabric available. Tossed blankets became shawls, potato sacks became vests, and a particularly enterprising child named Ruth had converted a coffee sack into trousers, albeit with the brand logo steam-roasted Guatemalan displayed prominently across her behind. As the morning grew less theoretical, plans began to form. Elias Wilkins, temporary patriarch, by unanimous proclamation after George Holcomb's eyebrows froze mid-sentence the night before, had called a meeting to determine escape routes from what was beginning to feel like a snow-covered eternity. He stood beside the camp's lee-slumped wagon, waving a stick like a general standing over a map made entirely of disappointment. "All right," he began, his voice gravelly from sleep and an undiagnosed onion allergy. "We've got two options. Either we wait here like biscuit batter until spring comes to thaw us, or..." He paused, his stick hovering in the air like an unsure wand. "Or we send a scouting party 3 miles to Snowdrift Ridge and see if the trail west is still passable." The silence was instant and unanimous. No one liked either choice. One woman audibly scoffed at the concept of spring. Another offered to turn into a carrot and hibernate, which was either satire or a side effect of eating lard with a spoon the night before. Despite the protests, the scouting party was assembled. It included Elias, who had nominated himself, of course, a man named Lyle, who had an alarming number of knives for someone in a frozen prairie, and Ashford, the soft-spoken fiddler, who everyone hoped would provide background music if things got tragic. They layered themselves in every wool, fur, and philosophical optimism they could find, and set off into the white, squinting like men who'd looked directly into existential uncertainty and decided to try anyway. Back at camp, things slowed into the peculiar rhythm of waiting. Children built snow people with dramatic flair, a 3-headed trader, a judge with icicle spectacles, and what appeared to be a frosty rendering of Queen Victoria riding a mule. Someone began boiling beans. Someone else swore quietly at their frozen socks. And 2 lovers, newly married and regretfully so, played cards in total silence, each pretending not to notice the other cheating. The sky above remained a thick apron of cottony cloud. Time bent and meandered the way it often does when one's only certainty is that somewhere over the horizon, a man named Lyle may be fighting a snowdrift with a butter knife. When the sun finally dipped below the dome of the prairie, having contributed almost nothing at all, other than mood lighting, a hush settled in. Fires crackled in a tentative, conspiratorial sort of way, as if fearful of attracting undue attention from the wind gods. Eliza tugged her shawl around her shoulders and watched the white glow fade into lavender. There was a peculiar beauty in the stillness, a sort of murmuring peace that came only after muscles had ceased complaining and lips had gone too numb to argue. She leaned back against the wooden slats of the wagon and wondered idly if spring snow tasted better than winter snow. Far out beyond the wagons, beyond the frozen pines and the soft, ghost whispers of drifts rolling across the ridgeline, Elias and his odd little party were making their way back, and they had seen something very curious indeed. But that's a tale for another cold night. It was the kind of cold that didn't so much nip at your nose as politely request your bones for containment. A steady hush blanketed the evening as the snow deepened around the wagon train, piling into soft drifts like flour sifted from the sky. By now, even the fire had stopped crackling with conviction. Small embers pulsed in the pit like a sleeping heart, while socks, rigid from days of wear and creative repairs, hung on nearby branches pretending to dry. Inside one modestly weatherproofed wagon belonging to the Quimbley family, a single candle trembled in its little holder like it was frightened of its own shadow. Around it, the family gathered under layers of quilts, buffalo hides, and what passed for comfort in a prairie winter, each other. Aunt Mary Beth tugged her woolen wrap tighter around her goosebumped shoulders. "I knew we should have taken the coastal route," she mumbled for the 14th time that day, despite the cold and the fact that the coastal route mostly existed on maps optimistically drawn by people who had never actually gone that way. Coastal route was 300 miles longer, full of river crossings, and ephemeral as a politician's promise, replied Silas Quimbley, the expedition's most reluctant optimist. Beyond the creaking canvas walls, the wind performed nightly symphonies over the prairie, dragging its sharp fingers across the frozen grass and howling under the oxen's breath. Animals, usually social and curious, now stood stoically huddled in pairs, chewing cud with the slow motion of beings who suspect the universe may be trying to make a point. Inside, the mood was equal parts resigned endurance and distracted domesticity. Letty, the youngest daughter, was doing her very best to knit a scarf from a tangled bag of yarn and goodwill. She kept dropping stitches and inventing new ones, effectively creating a textile no civilization had ever requested. Her concentration was admirable, despite the fact that her fingers looked roughly the shade of boiled beets. "You think anyone ever actually froze solid on the trail?" she asked, half in wonder, half in dread. "Happened to a man in the Dakota Territory," rumbled Jasper, Uncle something-in-law, who claimed to have read a pamphlet once, woke up stiff as his own fence posts, took until May Day to get a proper nod out of him. Marybeth gave Jasper a look that might have peeled paint from a picket fence. "Hush yourself," she said tartly. "Scaring children is bad for digestion." "I find digestion's been a bit theoretical lately anyway," Silas added, patting his middle, which had grown more symbolic in recent weeks. The scarcity of dried apples had been a low point, especially when they learned the supposed apples were actually shriveled parsnips borrowed from the next wagon over. Despite the chill and discomfort, there was a dreamy intimacy to blizzard nights like these. Something about the faint glow of a candle and the smell of snow filtering in with every gust made everything seem quieter, more deliberate. Time itself seemed to walk more slowly, as if adjusting to snowshoes. Outside, the wind picked up again, hauling small flurries through gaps in the wagon cover. Bits of snow danced in the candlelight, twinkling like ground-up stars. No one mentioned the howling anymore. It had merged into the background like a tired chorus repeating its same refrain. "Hold on, sleep soon." Aunt Marybeth had taken to stroking the head of Clover, their dog-shaped heat source, whose job mostly entailed lying near feet and exhaling warmth with admirable professionalism. Clover, in turn, had the polite neutrality of a creature whose ambitions rarely exceeded staying warm and occasionally stealing jerky. Somewhere near the back of the wagon, Pa Quimbley scribbled in his journal, chronicling their journey with an attention to factual accuracy that historians one day would find both helpful and oddly poetic. Heavy snow, spirits fair, socks worse. In that soft silence between the howl of wind and the wheeze of sleep, a peace settled, as if, buried beneath layers of hardship and snow, there remained something gently proud, human beings being stubbornly, hopelessly cozy. The candle flickered, drowsier now than ever, and slowly, as the shadows stretched and the wind reshaped the drifts like an unseen sculptor, the Quimbleys began to settle. Wraps tightened, heads tucked. Nothing heroic, just the quiet act of waiting out an unknowable storm. Tomorrow would have its own troubles, squeaky axles, frost-nipped fingers, and the logistical ballet that was communal oatmeal. But for now, they floated on the rocking wagon cradle under a quilt of buffalo hide and history. And not far off, the snow kept falling, soft and silent like the hush between thoughts, as another wagon's lantern glowed faintly against the endless white. By the velvet hush of late evening, the prairie had surrendered fully to winter's rule. The wind, always eager to offer unsolicited opinions, was whispering its cold secrets against the canvas of the wagon. Inside, a dull orange glow from the coals in the small iron stove gave the air a flickering warmth that didn't quite reach the toes, but whispered promises nonetheless. Martha sat with her back against a barrel of flour, though by now a more honest label might have been barrel of mostly crumbs and disappointment. She was darning a sock for the third time. Sock longevity on the trail was as hopeful a concept as breezes being warm in January. Each mend was more stitch than original cloth now, an embroidered testament to both thrift and denial. Outside, the snow had started again, a gentle procession of flakes, each with the singular ambition of smothering the earth. It had snowed 5 times this week already, and the ground was beginning to look like a poorly kept promise, white, cold, and unusually lumpy. Elijah, who claimed he could read the weather like an open book, was peering outside the wagon flap as if Carolus Linnaeus himself had hidden a botanical weather forecasting system in the sagebrush. Storm's gathering edge is darker than before, he mumbled with authority, referring to a small greyish cloud scampering west. Could be we're in its eye come midnight. In truth, Elijah had started predicting the weather mostly to impress Martha. It had worked early on, back when she confused confidence with accuracy, but after the time he mistook a dust devil for an approaching cavalry, she began treating his forecasts with the same gravity she awarded to the children's plans to domesticate squirrels. Young Thomas, whose wiry hair tended to stand up as if perpetually startled, was scribbling something in a charcoal notebook he called Mankind's Vital Observations. Much of it consisted of bird sightings exaggerated to mythical proportions and a running tally of how many times he'd been permitted to say the word fart without scolding. He paused to look up. "Pa, what if the snow don't stop?" Elijah turned solemn. "Then we'll just keep stopping it with hot potatoes and stubbornness, boy." And stubbornness they had in abundance. It was a secret currency of the wagon people, accepted at every makeshift roadside way station, traded in long glances and short, gruff conversations around icy campfires. Stubbornness was how they'd made it this far. Through axle snaps, desert crossings, recalcitrant oxen, and one memorable incident involving an overconfident goose. Now, though, it was snow, which, while not sentient, had a peculiar spitefulness. It crept past the second layer of boots. It numbed the tips of noses at breakfast, and it blanketed the wagon wheels so that each morning began with the musical sound of muffled swearing and enthusiastic shoveling. Inside the wagon, warmth hung like a stubborn dream. Miriam, aged 9 2/3, and quite insistent about the fraction, was carefully arranging polished pebbles in what she claimed was a representation of how brains probably look when frozen. To be fair, her model was more anatomically accurate than some 19th century medical textbooks, which, in a pinch, often described the human body with the same artistic liberties taken in medieval unicorn etchings. Against the canvas walls, shadows danced. The stove's flickering light caught the iron hooks where lanterns once hung, and where now a cured ham dangled like a monument to past abundance. They had agreed it wouldn't be eaten until Christmas or calamity, whichever came first. Old Nellie, their sour-tempered mule with a missing ear and a penchant for strategic flatulence, shuffled her hooves outside. Her breath formed clouds in the moonlight, and every now and then she made a noise deep in her throat that sounded, comfortingly, like disapproval. The prairie, for all its vastness, felt tucked in tonight. The snow was a quiet blanket, the wind a lullaby with too many verses. Nothing moved. Even the stars were still, pausing in their centuries of watchful winking to admire the fine art of human resilience. And somewhere, in the dark beyond the flame, a distant howl of wind curled like a slow question through the ravines. Not threatening, just inquisitive. Back inside the wagon, Martha leaned against that flour barrel again and yawned. She listened to the gentle breathing of her children, the occasional snore from Elijah, and the creak of the wood above her. In 3 days' time, the trail would reach the foot of the mountains. But as the snow gathered quietly over the wagon's bowed roof, all Martha could think was, please let Nellie not sit on the bacon again. And with that delicate thought folded into the hush of night, like a note passed between dreams, the covered wagon exhaled. The snow still fell. The stove still glowed. And just over the next ridge, something new was waiting. The storm had paused its howling, as if catching its breath out there in the white dark beyond the canvas flaps. Inside the covered wagon, with snow kissing the seams and the floorboards creaking softly beneath layers of quilts, time drooped like the snow-heavy branches of a pine tree. By now, the family had gone quiet, not out of fear, but necessity. Even conversation wasted warmth. You'd think silence would feel unsettling, but there was something oddly agreeable about it. Everyone was wrapped in wool, huddled like log cabin cinnamon buns, and the only occasional sounds were the snort of a sleeping mule outside and the recalibration of a human nose under a hand-knit scarf. And then, sniff sniff. Yes, it was the lantern, still burning the faintest curl of whale oil. Not exactly the scent of wilderness chic, but back in the 1840s, no one was picky. That dancing flame, a flickering speck of rebellion against the night, kept things just enough above the frozen emotional line. Now, here's the thing most people forget about life in a covered wagon. Everything mattered more. The slowness became not a hindrance, but the gear at which life operated. A single match was a treasure. A spoon was an heirloom. And a cardigan could become a family legend if it survived more than 2 winters and 1 boiler explosion. Folding your hands around a tin mug of sassafras tea wasn't just a warming habit. It bordered on high-performance art. Tonight, Jacob, the eldest son, 12 years old and already convinced he could fend off both bears and strong literary critiques, was inventing something under the blankets. His mother suspected it was another bean tin trap for snow mice. His father suspected it was another attempt at an alarm system for when little brother Marvin tried to steal the last biscuit. Whatever it was, Jacob tinkered quietly, hands moving by feel, like a frontier magician with nothing up his sleeves except windburn and ambition. Meanwhile, Marvin, a dubious biscuit thief at best, had fallen asleep with mittens on both ears. A preventative measure, he said earlier, against the yowling spirit wolves of the prairie. When gently reminded that those were in fact coyotes, and outside, he simply nodded the way small children do when they'd rather believe in folklore than make peace with logic. Back then, children knew fear, but they also knew how to fold it into lace. They grew up threading stories into their woolen hours, wrapping fables around their chills like an extra layer. And oh, did those wagon children tell stories. Beneath canvas tents and northern stars, they whispered of butter-churning ghosts, devilish frost spirits, and a haunted pair of suspenders that made your pants dance off you during barn socials. The mothers, yes, plural, because all women on the trail eventually became mothers of everyone within a 50-foot radius, knitted and re-knitted the same sock over and over. Not because the sock needed love, mind you, but because knitting was the closest thing to a meditative trance available before yoga and herbal teas came flaunting in with their wisdom. And besides, nobody admits it, but frontier women invented meditative breathing. They just called it holding in your complaints until spring. As for the fathers, well, they unfurled maps by lantern light and squinted at highways that didn't yet exist. There is an eternal expression men wear when reading maps they pretend to understand. It's usually a thoughtful frown that says, "Yes, I do know where Fort Laramie is," followed immediately by a pause that says, "I hoped you wouldn't ask me to prove it." Tonight, beneath thick hides and patchwork quilts, with the wind gossiping through seams and the fire casting silhouettes like hand puppet plays, no one truly slept. They merely drifted, somewhere between dream and vigilance. The wagons didn't creak forward tonight, but the minds inside them moved, turning over memories of springtime frost in Missouri, of lost mittens and found blessings, of pies made from suspiciously old apples and love folded into biscuit dough. Outside, another gust of wind swept through, playful this time, and sent a thin snarl of snow spiraling under the wagon's edge like a curious squirrel. It paused there, as if listening, before slipping off again into the silver silence of the plains. And just like that, the cold night continued its hush, while inside a covered wagon, wrapped snug in warmth and whimsy, the quiet weight of the journey held everyone in its gentle clasp. Soon, someone would sneeze and accidentally wake a mule, but not yet, not just yet. The sky wore a grey woolen shrug by late afternoon, the kind of sky that mutters rather than speaks, and certainly doesn't apologize for what's about to happen. Snowflakes had begun to fall, not in a grand, dramatic flurry, but the sort that tiptoes its way into being, curious, slow, and persistent. Somewhere on the wagon's westward path, the terrain had gently curled upward, and the air, noticeably sobered by altitude, settled into the traveller's chest like a polite yet judging aunt. Inside one of the canvas-covered wagons, conversation had dwindled to an occasional whisper, or a yawn disguised as a strategic sigh. Martha, God bless her, was knitting by sleet light now, her fingers a blur of pride and practicality, crafting a sock that would one day be found by a museum curator and mislabeled small handmade pouch, purpose unknown. The children huddled together under quilted layers, lost in the great childhood sport of pretending not to be cold. To them, this was still an adventure. The adults, however, knew better. They had begun trading glances of the "well, we may not die today, but I'm keeping a tally" variety. And yet, amid the cautious silence of the wagon train, it was Ambrose Haskett's moment to shine, or at least dimly flicker. Ambrose was a man renowned not for his bravery, nor his leadership, nor even his ability to churn butter without incident, but for his remarkably consistent pessimism. His presence on the journey had become something of a community barometer. If Ambrose looked only mildly alarmed, weather would likely be survivable. If he started composing hymns, it was time to worry. Ambrose now sat on a barrel near the rear of his wagon, peering into the falling snow like a man trying to remember whether he left the stove on, with the horrible realization that he had never owned a stove in the first place. "Reckon this'll be a squall worth sermonizing about," he said, entirely to himself, as his wife Cynthia passed him a ladle of stew and a look she'd been refining since Iowa. The blizzard was still polite, but building confidence. Snow muffled the world with great success. Every creak of the wagon, every oxfoot thunk into hardening dirt, became the only sound in the universe. Settlers wrapped themselves in buffalo robes and goose down theories about how long it might last. Evenings during these kinds of storms stretched like stories told by uncles with poor memory, rambling, slightly confusing, and reported to be based on true events. Dinner was consumed in hushed gratefulness, with food that tasted better simply because it was warm and involved precisely zero judgmental root vegetables. Most travel-weary wanderers found themselves reaching into the soft folds of their own thoughts, counting regrets and blessings like they were socks in a scarce laundry rotation. That night, Enoch Bell, one of the younger men of the caravan and self-appointed firewood philosopher, stood by the crackling blaze, a fire coaxed into life with more enthusiasm than science, and muttered dramatic phrases into the snowy void beside him. "Blizzards are nature's whisper, you know," he intoned to no one, stirring the fire as if each flame held secrets. "She don't want to surprise you. She just wants you to listen closely." A child nearby stared up at Enoch, bundling tighter into a quilt, both unsure and unimpressed. Across the wagons, some folks sang soft songs made up on the spot, slow tunes about perseverance and potatoes. Others exchanged stories older than the road itself, tales passed down from uncles and aunts who may or may not have been real. There's something peculiar about snow at night on the plains. You'd think it'd be harsh, an unforgiving white monster. But in the dark, it becomes something else. Flakes drift like they're gossiping, drunk on wind and lightly scandalized, while moonlight, if you're lucky, kisses the ground with such sleepy affection that even the frost-covered rocks look bashful. And so, the camp grew still. Breath fanned in ghostly puffs. Boots and feet shared space beneath woolen lumps that bore the shape of determined humanity. The blizzard made no sudden moves. It simply existed. Constant, slow, and a little bit smug. Miles away from anywhere, wrapped in history and stubbornness, the pioneers drifted toward slumber. Their dreams, if registered, were probably of hot coffee and shoes with dry opinions. But for now, they slept, all except Ambrose, who lay blinking at the undercarriage of the wagon canvas, silently debating which toes he liked best and whether he'd need to choose between them come morning. Outside, the hush deepened. The path ahead was blanketed, quiet, and waiting. Somewhere beyond the snow's curtain lay another day, wrapped warmly in uncertainty and frost-tinged hope. As midnight made itself comfortable above the Great Plains, the snow deepened into a steady hush, blanketing the land like a patient librarian silencing a raucous room. The covered wagons sat squat and resolute against the storm, their canvas tops frosted over like icing on stout loaves of bread left to cool too long. Inside one such wagon, our travellers lay bundled in wool and exhaustion, warmed by each other's breath and the soft flicker of a lantern that hadn't quite given up on the night. Augusta Stilwell, former school teacher and current wagon train philosopher of dubious qualifications, had been murmuring tidbits of knowledge to anyone still awake, or at least pretending to be. "Did you know," he said through a mouthful of molasses biscuit, "that in ancient Rome they thought snow could preserve fish, like nature's own icebox, and yet here we are, can't even keep our socks dry?" Nobody responded, which he took as encouragement. Across the wagon, his sister Hester sighed. her bonnet slightly askew, giving her the air of a weary nightingale. She didn't correct his historical embellishments anymore. That battle had been lost somewhere on the Kansas border, right around the same time they discovered how truly unappetizing squirrel stew could be. Outside, the wind carried its mournful wail through the cracks in the wagon canvas, finding sympathetic wooden beams to rattle and poke. It wasn't a howl exactly, not the sharp, haunted scream we might imagine, but more of a spectral yawn that just wouldn't end. The sort of sound that might make a person wonder if the sky itself were cold and a bit annoyed. The horses, bundled under braided blankets, stomped periodically in lodgepole-picked rhythm, their breath curling like ghost smoke in the lantern light. They were hardy beasts, bred for the trail and too experienced to panic at a bit of weather. They regarded the blizzard with the same indifference they had earlier shown to Augustus's attempt to explain the Pythagorean theorem using rope and a stick. In short, with deep, equine disinterest. Within the warmth of the wagon, little Emmy Clark was curled beneath 3 shawls, clutching the wooden doll her father had whittled out of an old fence post salvaged in Nebraska. The doll had no arms and one button eye, the other having fled during a particularly turbulent river crossing. But Emmy loved her still. The doll's name was Penelope, though she often went by Miss Penny, a nod to Boston upper crust Emmy had never met, but clearly admired. Mary Clark, Emmy's mother, lay beside her with one hand near the stove, gauging its waning heat. The small cast-iron heater, barely the size of a pumpkin pie tin, had been their salvation since dusk, fed with caution and reverence like an altar fire. The embers blinked sleepily, yawning light and sighing curls of smoke through the pipe punched neatly through the wagon top. The stove's warmth couldn't reach everything, but it reached enough. Years like this, Mary muttered softly, almost to herself. You learn to weigh every twig like gold. And she was right. Wood, in the middle of a snow-choked prairie, was no longer a convenience, it was currency. A twig now bore the worth of tinder, of tea, of survival. Children were quietly taught the difference between what could be burned and what might be better served as a hairbrush handle later. Priorities, on the frontier, rearranged themselves under weather's gaze. Outside, the snow deepened into lullaby. It softened noise, rounded edges. Time itself seemed to crouch low and slow down, arrested by the gentle oppression of falling white. In the distance, if one listened past the heartbeat-like crackle of snow against canvas, past the distant spark of whippoorwill dreams, you might imagine you heard another wagon creak, or maybe just the groaning memory of one. Then came a quiet rustling, boots on packed snow. Not a warning, merely the sound of someone crossing camp. It was Jerome, the wagon master, making his rounds. He walked the perimeter with a lamp lit low and a blanket around his shoulders like some solemn, shivering shepherd. Where he walked, he left small impressions, soon swallowed by snow, as if he'd never been at all. Inside, the fire dipped a little lower, the breath of the night stretching long across slumbering cots. Not far from the wagon's wooden wheel, a small pot rested in packed snow, tonight's washwater, now transformed into a solid argument against the efficiency of 19th century hygiene. And in the calm, somewhere between sleeping and waking, it became clear. Survival on the trail wasn't dramatic, not often. It was quiet, inventive, methodical, sometimes even funny, if only to keep the chill from getting too smug. Snow fell as softly as a page turning in an unread book, and just like that, the vast white night pressed gently on, without apology or haste, toward the next moment. The wind had been groaning all afternoon, like an elderly accordion attempting Yankee Doodle for the 1000th time. And now, as night lowered its frosted curtain, it decided to get serious. The covered wagon, once a proud little vessel of canvas and creaking timber, now shivered in place like a nervous footstool. Outside, the world had vanished in a white veil. Inside, the Jones family reached a new understanding of the term close quarters. Father, committed to the noble delusion that keeping boots on makes a man more capable, dozed against a vinegar barrel, using a sack of beans as his pillow. Mother was humming a hymn through her teeth, while mending a sock with determined fury. It was her 6th sock of the evening, not necessarily because the children had that many pairs to begin with, but because the repetitive motion kept her from screaming. Young Amos, no older than 10 and stubborn as fence post rust, had declared he would stay awake and guard the camp. That noble duty lasted precisely 12 minutes before he slumped sideways into a gravy pot lid and began snoring like a miniature mule. It was the kind of night where everything creaked, including time. Now, to truly appreciate the eerie power of a blizzard night on the 19th century frontier, one must understand a few things about those early American wagons. They were less wagon in the modern sense and more wooden optimism on wheels. Drafted together with iron bands, wooden pegs, and prayer, they were excellent at carrying 3 essential items: perseverance, pie fillings, and a staggering amount of human body odor. Insulation was as theoretical as flying machines. When the temperature dipped below freezing, and it always dipped, it did strange things to the mind. Sounds warped. The wind seemed smarter. You could swear it was saying your name, although in fairness, the wind's vocabulary, even at its most eloquent, was mostly just woo. To keep from freezing or panicking, or worse, freezing while panicking. Travelers often swapped frontier folk stories. And that evening, by the flickering light of a tallow candle stub, Grandmother Edith reached deep into her quilted memory and shared one. Back in 49, she began, the children already captivated just by the date. A man got so snowblind he claimed he'd seen the Pacific Ocean from Ohio. Silas, the oldest, blinked. That's impossible. Exactly what his horse said, Grandmother replied, narrowing her eyes. The truth is, winter on the trail didn't just test your strength, it exercised your imagination. Many a pioneer found comfort in tall tales, partly because they were entertaining, and partly because they distracted from the awareness that their socks were gradually freezing to the floorboards. Mother, pausing her sock surgery, added her own recollection. There was that one family, remember? The Cartwells. They layered so many quilts their wagon collapsed. Claimed it was safer traveling by quilt anyway. The children giggled sleepily. The stories were working, stretching time like molasses and softening the sharp edge of the present. Outside, the snow continued its patient attack on the world. Drifts piled up against the wheels. Somewhere, a coyote gave a lonesome, show-off yodel. But even it seemed muffled by the thick hush of the cold. Inside the wagon, the candle guttered, casting shadows that danced from one timber beam to the next. Each shape, a flickering hat, a slumped elbow, a half-eaten biscuit, seemed to carry stories of its own. No one remarked on it, but each family member gradually tucked hands, feet, or faces against one another. Warmth, like hope and bacon grease, was best shared. A curious stillness settled into the wagon, one that had nothing to do with silence, and everything to do with everything being snug in its place. even if that place was the middle of nowhere inside a canvas bubble that was half tent, half travelling cupboard. Their world, tiny and battered though it was, remained upright under the weight of the storm, just barely, but upright. And as the wind howled on, doing its worst opera impression, the Jones family drifted, one by one, into sleep. Even the dog, who had spent the day trying to eat a frozen turnip, curled up into father's coat and sighed with relief. The storm had not passed yet. It would linger, like an unwelcome dinner guest who mistakes the coat rack for a chair. But there was stillness now, a gathering in, a gathering close. And as the cold pressed harder against the canvas, something old and unseen stirred at the edge of the plains, an instinct deeper than fear, older than maps, something that would soon carry them into the next part of their journey, where even frost had stories to carve in the dark. The wind howled with a peculiar elegance through the narrow seams of the canvas wagon cover, and every so often a roaming gust gave the side of the wagon a dignified ruffle, as if nature herself were gently knocking to see if anyone had tea on. Inside, the heat from the little iron stove burned low, the coals giving off a sleepy red glow, like an ember with secrets. It was the kind of blizzard night where snowflakes fell in such abundance. They stopped being individual flakes and became a steady whisper, nature's own lullaby in shushing rhythm. The family inside the wagon, the Cartwrights, were burrowed deep into makeshift beds, mostly layered quilts over straw-stuffed ticking and a modest commotion of elbows and knees. Despite the cold, or perhaps because of it, this was the hour for stories, those fermented yarns drawn from great-grandma's slipper-shaped memory or Uncle Eli's habit of embellishment. They weren't told to battle the fear of the storm outside, but perhaps to tame it. After all, it's hard to feel scared of a blizzard when you're laughing at the time Aunt May mistook a possum for the Holy Spirit. Father Cartwright, with a face like aged parchment and a beard that expressed its opinions in all directions, cleared his throat and began his nightly tale. Did I ever tell you about the time I nearly froze clean solid during the winter of '47? He mused, voice slow as molasses on a cold spoon. Not 1847. No, I mean the winter so cold it made the cows forget how to moo. The children all knew this story. They knew every dramatic beat, every overstatement, and particularly the part where he claimed his bottle of ink froze so instantly mid-letter that the pen snapped from confusion. But it warmed them all the same. There's a comfort in familiar stories during unfamiliar nights. Outside, the snow piled without hesitation. That was the way of things on the American frontier. Blizzards didn't ask permission. They just arrived in boots, unannounced, and kicked open the door to whatever plans you had scrambled together. Back then, measuring snow wasn't a business of inches or feet. It was more like how many cows tall it was. 3 cow snow meant the drifts were higher than your average dairy beast. 5 cow snow was biblical. And tonight's storm? No one wanted to measure. Despite this, settlers adapted with the stubbornness of folks allergic to giving up. They wove buffalo hides into makeshift footwear, burned dried-out prairie chips when wood was scarce, which, yes, is easier to understand once you know that prairie chips was a euphemism for dried buffalo dung, pleasantly flammable, and one assumes mildly scented. Necessity is the mother of innovation, and desperation her eccentric aunt. But winter wasn't all catastrophe. No, there were cozy moments too, like tonight, when the world outside went white and time inside went soft. The children, heads puddled across pillows, drifted into dreams painted with horses and cabins and oversized mittens. Ma Cartwright quietly stirred something over the iron stove. A tin pot of snow, boiled down with molasses and pine. Tree syrup tea, she called it, though it tasted like winter politely declined. Still, it was warm, and if you wrapped your fingers around the cup just right, you could pretend it was made of gold. Out on the plains, somewhere, near the horses, who had long since given up protesting the snow, was a lean, ice-speckled man named Franklin Mertz, a bachelor neighbor known for wearing 2 hats and answering questions before they were asked. Franklin was not technically invited, but had wedged himself into the corner of the bonneted wagon earlier, claiming to be lost philosophically more than geographically. He was now writing poetry with his boot in the frost on the wagon wall. Lines like, "Oh snow, thy cousin's slush," is but a crude haiku, which no one really knew how to respond to. Even the snow seemed uncertain whether to admire or ignore him. As the candlelight lopped gently on the canvas above, dimming like the day's final thought, the family curled tighter under their blankets. It was not silence outside. They could still hear the wind's choir, gusty and cold, and always a little dramatic. But it was safety. The soft sort earned not by comfort, but sheer stubborn humanity. One child, already mostly asleep, murmured, "What do snowmen do in a blizzard?" To which Father Cartwright, eyes twinkling, replied, "Same thing we do, darling. They just wait for the morning." And so, as snow thickened and night deepened, the wagon settled, half buried and wholly warmed by the strange magic of togetherness. Somewhere beneath the blankets, a finger twitched in dreams, chasing something vague and happy. And just as the candle flickered its final wink, the sky stirred with something new. A pause in the storm, or perhaps the hint of a gentler wind, nudging the story forward. After 3 days of snow that fell as gently as flour through a sieve, the wagon party awoke to an eerie sort of silence. The storm had ended sometime in the night, but in its place was a hush so complete, one might have thought the world had pressed the mute button. Snow blanketed everything. Trees stooped under its hush-hush weight. Wagons nestled like frosted gingerbread houses. And even the oxen stood unusually still, as if pondering the philosophical implications of snow in the nostrils. When snow fell on the Great Plains with this sort of ambition, it often brought a peculiar transformation, not only to the land, but also to behavior. Even the loudest talkers among the group now spoke in low tones, as if afraid of disturbing some delicate spell cast upon the prairie. It's a well-known but rarely mentioned fact that after a blizzard, 19th century wagon folk developed the uncanny instinct of speaking in library voices for approximately 48 hours. It didn't make the cold any warmer, but it was, somehow, polite. The snow had softened the hard edges of wagon life. The ruts and bumps of the trail were buried under a pillowy white illusion, tricking one into believing the path forward would now be less painful on the posterior. It wouldn't be, of course. Snow hides many things, and topography is one of them. But for this brief morning, wrapped in quilts and watching their breath curl like question marks in the air, the travelers suspended their disbelief. Now, let's talk about breakfast. Cooking after a snowstorm on the open trail was an act of courageous optimism. First, you had to locate the firewood, which was likely as dry as an apology fashioned from wet sponge. Then came the fire-starting ceremony, an elaborate ritual involving flint, hope, and the occasional impolite muttering from behind a mitten. And finally, if all went well and the fire caught, you might be treated to a breakfast of partially thawed dried apples, oatcakes that had made peace with their chalky texture, and, if the stars really aligned, a sliver of bacon as stiff as frontier law. But this morning, there was a surprise. Someone had found a buried store of coffee grounds. This was no small affair. Coffee in a snowed-in Wagon circle was nothing less than an ignition switch for morale. It was prepared in a blackened tin pot over a sputtering twig fire, thick enough to be mistaken for liquid courage, and just bitter enough to remind you not all luxuries come without cost. The smell alone could coax a person back from the edge of winter-induced melodrama. Even the oxen seemed slightly perkier. As they sipped from tin mugs, hands cradling warmth, the travellers regarded the dazzling white horizon with the wary respect you'd afford a lion with a powdered wig. Majestic, yes, but not to be trusted. It was around then that someone raised the topic of next steps. You see, decisions among wagon groups weren't always as orderly as one might hope. There was no CEO of covered wagons, no prairie parliament. Instead, decisions arose through a marvelously inefficient blend of group opinion, loudest voice wins, and whatever the oldest person happened to mumble just before dozing off. Mr. Abner Pilkes, a gentleman whose beard had begun to resemble a woolly stalactite, declared that continuing west would require more sense than shoes, which no one fully understood, but everyone nodded at appreciatively. Mrs. Eliza Cupper, who had not once removed her bonnet since Cincinnati, lobbied for staying put another day to let the oxen recollect themselves, a phrase so endearing that it temporarily suspended further debate. Eventually, consensus emerged in a ripple of shrugs and quiet assent. They would wait another day. Children constructed snow lumps of various interpretive quality, allegedly representing snowmen. The adults gathered by wagons, walked slow circuits to keep circulation going, and shared stories, their words little puffs of steam in the frozen morning air. There was even a bit of laughter that afternoon. Not the rowdy kind, mind you, but the gentle, knowing laughter that comes only when you're cold to the bone, slightly miserable, and yet profoundly aware that there's a kind of magic in enduring something miserable together. A comfort in knowing that others are just as hungry for heat, for hope, for the whisper that spring might arrive eventually, riding quietly over the hills like a bashful guest. That night, as the wind curled softly through the spokes of sleeping wagons and coyotes barked their private jokes to a sympathetic moon, the camp settled once more beneath its snowy duvet. Somewhere, a lone fiddle played a tune that wavered between melancholy and mischief, and as the stars embroidered the sky in quiet confidence, a warmth of another kind began to grow, not from the fires, but from an unspoken belief shared among strangers, that after every storm there waits a road, even if snow hides it for a time, and that tomorrow, well, tomorrow might just be a walking day. The wind had not let up, though it had taken on a less aggressive tone, as if finally tiring of its own endless complaint. Snowflakes now floated slow and deliberate, thick as goose feathers loose from a pillow fight among angels. Beneath the heavy canvas of the McAllister family's prairie schooner, breath curled like smoke, and the lantern burned low, its flame doing little more than hum a small tune to itself. Inside, the wagon was quieter than usual. Even little Thomas, renowned for his astonishing ability to both wiggle and whine simultaneously, had gone still, lulled perhaps by the rhythmic sound of ice ticking against canvas, like a polite stranger perpetually asking to be let in. Mrs. McAllister was knitting by low lamplight, or trying to. Her fingers, wrapped in mittens with the ends snipped off for dexterity, moved slower than usual. The yarn, once tightly spun, now had the memory of dampness. Progress was being made, technically. A sock-shaped object was forming. It might also have been a mild insult to the art of knitting, but by Wagon standards, it was practically couture. "Did you know," she said slowly, eyes squinting at her needlework, "that Napoleon's army froze not from bad planning, but bad socks?" Mr. McAllister blinked from his position near the back wheel, where blankets and a questionable squirrel pelt were wrapped around him like some frontier burrito. "That feels like a stretch." "No, truly." She paused, considered, then added, "Well, a slight stretch, but there was frostbite, and someone definitely under-budgeted wool." He chuckled. "If my toes fall off, I'm writing a letter to Bonaparte." They both knew there was no post, of course, and while Napoleon had been dead for nearly 6 decades, that seldom stopped westward folks from threatening correspondence with the deceased. It was both a coping mechanism and a hobby. Outside, somewhere in the gently murmuring dark, the oxen shifted. Their silhouettes loomed just at the edge of the lantern's reach, big, patient creatures chewing silently, steam curling from nostrils into the frost-bitten night. Tied snug to the wagon tongue and facing away from the wind, they were resigned partners in this great migration. Not so much enthusiastic travelers as extremely large introverts forced into a group trek. Young Mary, age 7, stirred under her quilt cocoon, made of 3 heavy woolen blankets and a creatively repurposed curtain. She blinked up at her mother. "Mama, does it snow inside a mountain?" Mrs. McAllister considered this. "Not unless the mountain is having an emotional winter," she said gently. Mary nodded solemnly, satisfied, and turned her attention to her most prized possession, a little wooden doll named Abigail Agnes Willow, whose head had been temporarily separated last month during a minor accident involving a runaway pie tin. She now wore a bonnet tied snugly enough to disguise battle damage, and lay nestled in a shoebox with the air of a casualty from some plucky militia of gingerbread. Back in his blanket burrito, Mr. McAllister had begun scratching notes in his journal by lantern light. Nothing ornate, just the daily scribbles of a man attempting to make sense of a life that involved counting days, meals, and frostbite incidents. He dated the page, February 3rd, and beneath it wrote, "Blizzard held, still cold, socks undergoing existential crisis." He paused, tapping the nib of the pen to his lower lip. "Family warm, spirits high, snow up to axle. Lost 1 mitten this morning, unrelated to moral decline." He set the journal aside. The fire had burned down to a bundle of glowing coals inside its iron basin, which the McAllisters called the Wagon hearth. It was how early settlers managed heat, bringing coals from the last campsite or stopping to let embers gather beneath kindling like secrets in a storybook. Tonight's fire was humble, but it had personality. And so, their little travelling house, a canvas ark adrift on the frozen sea of the prairie, hummed on, the way all frontier homes hummed in winter, a mix of wood creaks, cinnamon breath, quiet prayers, and the gentle gossip of wool. As Mrs. McAllister returned to her charmingly lopsided sock and the snow continued its whisper-slow descent, Thomas murmured something unintelligible from his pile of quilts. It might have been a dream, or a demand for pie, possibly both. Mr. McAllister reached for more ink, his pen ready to capture the tiniest slivers of existence, proof that they were here, cold but real, in this moment that no one else would see. Outside, somewhere on the endless snow-sculpted plain, a coyote howled once, long, slow, and surprisingly polite. And the wind, never one to leave a conversation unfinished, whirled quietly on toward the horizon. The wind had tired itself out by evening, sighing softly now against the creaking wall of canvas, as if politely asking forgiveness for its tantrum earlier. A hush lay over the camp, like a thick woolen quilt, heavy, warm, and just slightly itchy. To be fair, much of the quiet could be credited to the snowdrifts climbing up the sides of the wagon like sleepy mountain goats settling in for the night. It had been a long day of whimpering fires, frozen mustaches, and making lukewarm tea out of melted snow and dangerously optimistic herbs. Inside the covered wagon, the lantern flame flickered low, unsure whether it was still on duty or simply too sleepy to quit. Ma had wrapped herself and the children in every stitch of fabric she could scrounge. Shawls that once belonged to aunts, socks that used to belong to Uncle Milt, and a knitted monstrosity they only called the muffler. A scarf so suspiciously long, it may have been originally intended for a horse. Pa sat near the front flap of the wagon, staring cautiously into the night beyond the frozen canvas, holding his musket like a man who half expected the snow itself to come alive and ask for directions westward. He didn't really expect wolves. Not tonight. Even wolves couldn't be bothered to trudge through snow up to their eyebrows. But fathers on the trail always did two things before bed. One, they worried, and two, they sat up with a completely unnecessary weapon, feeling noble about it. The blizzard had worsened since midday, but had the decency to do so quietly now. Snowflakes that once daggered down in hostile formation had softened into lazy spirals, as if the storm had grown introspective and moody. The canvas roof above bore their weight with a resilient groan, occasionally puffing free drizzles of powdered frost through the seams. Occasionally, a droplet of melted snow would find its way to Ma's nose and remind her that roofing technology in 1847 was often a suggestion more than a science. Little Elijah, wrapped up like an overstuffed cabbage, had stopped asking when they would arrive at Oregon. That was phase 2 of trail fever, resignation. Phase 1 had involved rabid enthusiasm and loud proclamations about becoming a mountain man. Phase 3 would be whittling, characterized by Elijah slowly carving useless wooden objects for spiritual survival. He was already eyeing one of the wagon's support beams with quiet ambition. Meanwhile, the stew pot had reached an impressive lukewarm. No one spoke of the unidentifiable meat in it. They had all agreed, kindly and without discussion, that it had been something the family didn't name. It wasn't that they were squeamish, though, let's be honest, Eliza still hadn't recovered from discovering jerky could come from squirrels. But on a night like this, food was food, and anything that could be chewed with relative confidence and didn't glow in the dark was promoted to supper. As the quiet grew thicker, muffled under a blanket of white that threatened to last until April, thoughts drifted. Not to anything important, just gentle, stray ideas. Ma wondered what spring would smell like when it finally came. Pa pictured a barn, steady and wide, all his. Elijah thought about whether snowflakes had names. Eliza wondered if chickens in Oregon wore coats. Somewhere deeper in the camp, another wagon's occupants began to sing softly, a hymn warbled and half forgotten, like a melody pulled from a dream. No one minded the off-key notes. In fact, they were oddly comforting. Historical footnote: pioneers did, in fact, sing. Often for comfort, sometimes for warmth. Those gathered songs did double as light cardio, and occasionally just to drown out the unsettling rustling noises that might have been raccoons auditioning for the role of ghost near the food stash. Back in their own wagon, Ma finally allowed the lantern to burn itself out, moving only to close the little side flap and tuck in the corners of the quilt, as if she could seal out the wilderness through sheer commitment to tidiness. As the silence deepened again, and the world tucked itself around the wagon, a single pine tree cracked in the distance from the weight of the snow, a reminder that everything in this landscape bowed eventually, under snow, under stars, under time. Pa's eyes finally closed, his musket sinking across his lap like a forgotten worry. And somewhere, farther ahead down the trail, the wind whispered promises of a thaw. A wishful notion, perhaps. But then again, out here, wishes were often the most reliable form of navigation. The wind had calmed a little by the time dusk arrived, but not enough to stop it from sounding like someone was dragging a choir of ghostly fiddles across the prairie. It pulled at the wagon's canvas like a child shaking a stubborn Christmas gift, hoping it might reveal something sweet inside. But inside was only the Harris family, tucked like spoons under scratchy quilts, clutching tin mugs of lukewarm sassafras tea and trying very hard not to think about how many wolves sounded like wind and how much wind sounded like wolves. Snow had begun to pile against the wagon's wheels in soft, floury heaps, melting just enough to freeze into the kind of crust that made every step a gamble. Outside, the oxen were cloaked in gunny sacks and blankets, an act of kindness with a touch of futility. Oxen, famously unbothered by the existential ponderings of hypothermia, simply stared into the void, with the zen patience of a winter monk who chews cud. Around the small fire, protected by a circle of rocks, and the dubious optimism of canvas flaps angled just so, Ethan Harris dawdled with his pocket knife, whittling something that, if viewed from a generous distance, might resemble a fork, or a spear, perhaps a fish, if one squinted very hard and had never seen fish before. "This one's for Ma," he said, proudly holding up the lumpy artifact. Ma gave it a look of fond tolerance, the same one she'd given when he'd tried to knit a scarf, using nothing but leftover twine and 2 turkey feathers. She took it in hand, weighed it gently, and nodded. "Reckon that'll fetch quite a price at the next Paris salon," she said evenly. "Napoleon himself might bid for it." Ethan wasn't entirely sure where Paris was, but he liked when Ma talked fancy. The stove inside the wagon, an iron fixture about the size of a determined pumpkin, radiated uneven warmth. It popped and hissed with every dry stick it devoured, wheezing like a sleeping dog. Each family member took turns warming their toes near it, while the rest pretended that inhaling warm air counted as equal participation. "You know," Pa mused, as he shuffled another bundle of twigs into the stove, "the Donner Party hit snow like this at some point." This earned him a collection of groans and sighs. "Pa, we're not eating each other," came Ruth's muffled reply from beneath a quilt fortress the size of a haystack. "I didn't say we would," Pa defended. "Just makes a man grateful is all." "Grateful we remembered beans, not just 6 harmonicas," Ma added, her voice dry as toast. In fairness, musical instruments had seemed like a good idea in Missouri. In Missouri, you still thought you'd sing your way to Oregon every evening over a campfire, while your daughter married a good mule skinner with all his own teeth and a steady handshake. Out here, entertainment had shifted. Now, it mostly involved naming icicles. "That one's General Lafayette," said Ethan, pointing toward a long, drippy specimen clinging to the wagon's edge. Ruth popped her head out. "How are you sure it's a general?" "Look at the poise," Ethan explained. He commands other icicles. Ruth raised an eyebrow. You need sleep. The wind answered with a low, mournful howl, pressing against the canvas like a child hesitating about knocking on a door that might open on trouble. It was neither friend nor enemy, just breath between worlds. In the stillness that followed, snowflakes began tapping the roof, slow at first, then quicker, like they were racing one another down invisible ladders. Tomorrow will be another firewood day, Pa said, peering through a tiny flap in the wagon. Trees don't grow closer in blizzards. No, Ma said gently, but boys do when they chop 'em. She tousled Ethan's shaggy hair, then retreated back under the covers, her breath misting like a visiting ghost. Somewhere near the stove, Rudy, the family's mutt and part-time foot warmer, snored with the satisfied recklessness of a creature who had perfectly mastered the art of trusting the humans. They drifted, one by one, into a kind of shared dreaminess, the sort only found in places where there are more shadows than clocks and more snow outside than there are memories inside. Sleep came gently, wrapped in the quiet of frost-laced canvas and the lullaby of rattling iron. And just as the last candle gave up its tiny glow, outside, beyond the reach of tired eyes, something glimmered on the snow, something curious and unexpected, under stars that had watched Wagon families long before this one, and would continue well after, into the stillness of another day, to come. Outside the canvas walls of the wagon, the wind sounded like an old man complaining, soft at first, then gradually rising into a full-bodied grumble, as if the prairie had gotten out of bed too fast and now its back hurt. Inside the Lowry family's wagon, tucked amid quilts that smelled of wool, lye, and just a whisper of yesterday's beans, the world moved more slowly. The storm outside couldn't reach the lantern-lit cocoon they'd made for themselves, at least not right away. Between the faint glow of the flame and the lull of the rocking chassis, time blurred a little. That peculiar kind of prairie night had arrived, the kind where nothing happened, except the subtle unraveling of sanity by snowflake. The fire in the small travel stove had been reluctant at first, like a teenager at chore time, but with a bit of coaxing from Grandpa Morton, who believed wholeheartedly in the motivational properties of muttering, it had agreed to stay alight, for now. It radiated just enough warmth to thaw fingers without roasting toes. They'd built it atop packed earth and surrounded it with bricks they'd carried in case of emergencies or boredom, which in 1847 were often the same thing. Little Sarah sat cross-legged in front of the stove, cradling the family's most precious heirloom, a tin cup with 3 dents, 1 story, and no handle. If you asked her, it had once belonged to President Van Buren, who had tossed it into the brush for reasons political and mysterious. If you asked her mother, it was from the general store in Independence and accidentally run over by the wagon wheel. Either way, it was the only cup that made the sassafras tea taste like something worth sipping slowly. Ezekiel, who had not been able to sleep since the mule tried to eat his socks that morning, was staring thoughtfully at the ice forming along the inside of the wagon roof. An enterprising youth of 11, he decided this resembled a miniature version of the Alps. Not the actual Alps, of course, but the way his schoolbook had described them. White, intimidating, and full of consequences for those who underestimated mountain goats. Meanwhile, Ma and Pa Lowry were in the middle of an argument so mild it could have been mistaken for polite conversation. It centered around whether stacking the salt pork above the flour barrels constituted wise provisioning or an invitation to greasy biscuits. Neither had won, which in marriage sometimes meant both had. Outside, the snow thickened, muting the whistle of the wind into a sort of woolly hush. Every flake felt ancient, like it had been waiting patiently for its moment to fall, spending centuries in the sky making up its mind. And now, here they were, sheets of white slowly erasing the strange tracks left behind by oxen, boots, and one over-ambitious rooster who had, for reasons known only to the feathered, insisted on leading the way for 4 miles. Time was told by the popping of the stove, the occasional snore of the eldest family member, and the creaking groan of the wagon's wooden frame expanding or protesting, hard to say which. The quiet began sinking into bones and eyelids alike. Everything except the snow had slowed to a gentle shiver. Grandpa Morton, now half asleep and half sure he'd been a corporal in the War of 1812, he hadn't, held forth on why peppermint oil was better than whiskey for frostbite, to which no one responded, not because they disagreed, but because he was speaking into his mitten. The storm would pass, as storms do, in its own petulant time. But tonight, it was queen of the plains, sweeping across the sagebrush with chilly grace. And within their little wooden and canvas realm, the Lowrys had done what families do best in the face of nature's spectacle. They endured it together, semi-conscious and well blanketed. Somewhere in the dark distance, a tree creaked in protest, or possibly approval. The blizzard had settled in for the evening, and who were they to argue with something that fell upward, spun sideways, and landed in accidental perfection on every brittle tuft of prairie grass? In the gentle flicker of the lantern's last light, Ma reached for her knitting, Pa reached for silence, and the children drifted dangerously close to bedtime without even realizing they'd been lulled there by wind and wool and stories half-whispered. And just as another log settled in the stove with a sleepy sigh, strange noises crept through the distant snowdrifts. A metallic clang, followed by what could only be described as purposeful shuffling. But for now, let's rest a while longer. Snowflakes the size of handkerchiefs fell from the skies like sleepy dancers, landing in soft piles upon wagon covers and prairie grass stiff with frost. By now, the prairie was less a place than a whisper, silent, vast, and so still it felt as if the world around the wagon had taken its own nap. Somewhere out in that white-sheeted landscape, the hoot of an owl punctuated the hush, dignified as a schoolteacher delivering bedtime instructions to the moon. Inside the wagon, where the cold scraped its fingernails along the canvas sides but never quite got in, things had settled into the kind of quiet you only hear after days of snow. The children, wrapped burrito-like in quilts, passed down from grandmothers who sniffed at buttons and believed in goose fat as medicine, were tucked away, dreaming dreams that involved more soup and fewer chores. Hiram Wentworth, the unofficial evening fire tender, oat boiler, and occasional philosopher, sat near the gently glowing embers inside the makeshift tent they'd pitched over the wagon bed to trap the warmth. He stared, half-lidded, at the iron kettle swaying gently like a timepiece, forgetting its duties. The fire didn't crackle like dramatic fires in storybooks. It hummed, lulled by the snow pressing in on every side. A sleepy fire for sleepy folks. This night, not much was said. That was the trick to surviving winter on the trail. Not just food and furs, but knowing when to let silence do the talking. Sometimes people asked whether pioneers were lonely. The truth? Not exactly. Loneliness requires the time to notice you're alone. But when you're worried about whether the bacon's frozen solid, or if your socks will stand up stiff when you take them off. You tend to bond more with survival than introspection. Henrietta, seated opposite Hiram near the coals, was mending everyone's gloves with the grim determination of a person who had grown up threading needles by candlelight during thunderstorms. Her fingers moved like spider legs, faster than one would expect from hands half hidden in fingerless scraps. "I've patched these same mittens 3 times this week," she noted softly, aware her voice could disturb the calm like a pebble in clear pond water. "That's called frontier recycling," murmured Hiram, sipping what claimed to be coffee, but was more accurately described as something hot and convincingly brown. "Gloves don't leave until they give their full measure." There was a polite pause, filled with the weight of both pride and shared fatigue. The blizzard outside continued murmuring over the landscape. Snow piling up against the wheels, halfway up the sides of the wagon now. Soon they'd be more igloo than vehicle. But it was okay. That was the blizzard's kindest magic. Once it had you snowed in, it left you alone. They had only encountered one other traveler that day, a lone teamster named Samuel, who had lost 2 oxen to the bitter cold, and now dragged his cart with stubborn mule power and an attitude that could salt the very snow. He'd joined them briefly for stale cornbread and warmer talk, then disappeared back into the silence as if summoned by the ghost of westward optimism. Outside, the snow was sculpting curious things. The front of the wagon had developed a pair of icicle tusks that made it look more mammoth than mule cart. If you squinted through the frost-painted canvas window, you might have imagined prehistoric creatures wandering the plains once again, wearing earmuffs and mid-western accents. There was a certain peace to it all, a peace built from surrender and tiny victories, a fire that hadn't gone out, a pot that hadn't cracked, a single potato, miraculously unfrozen, waiting its turn to become stew royalty. As the night edged further in, adding weight to the canvas overhead, Henrietta finished her patchwork and tucked the thread beneath her layers of skirts, preparing to slide into her pile of quilts with all the grace of a curling cat. Hiram carefully banked the fire, lowering its flame but never its heart, and sneaked one last look through the wagon flap. The sky was doing that thing it saved for rare magical nights, turned the color of a faded quilt, stitched with stars and feathered with cloud banks. It didn't glow so much as it shimmered shyly, like it was unsure if it wanted to be seen. Heaven's own lantern, dimmed for sleep. And somewhere beneath all of it, the covered wagon snored gently in the snow. Not really a snore, but the creaking wood and slow settling groans that old wagons made when dreaming of smoother roads and warmer towns. They would not move on tomorrow, the snow would see to that, but perhaps the day after. For now, there were no schedules in the snow, only breath and quiet, and the comforting thought that, in the soft-held silence of a wagon caught in winter's embrace, nothing awful was likely to happen before breakfast. And above all that, sleep drifted in on snowflakes, ready to tell a new story come morning. In the breathless hush after a prairie blizzard, time seems to lose its grip. Snow hushes every clatter of existence into submission, like a stern but kind grandmother with a woolen shawl who demands silence so she can concentrate on her knitting. And beneath that heavy knitted sky, our intrepid wagon party sat cocooned in the peculiar warmth that settles just after surviving a bout of atmospheric misbehavior. The world outside looked like someone had spilled an overly enthusiastic bowl of cream across the land and then smoothed it all into neat folds. The wind, having flailed itself into exhaustion, now whispered apologies through the cracks in an icy falsetto. Inside the wagon, life adjusted in slow motion. Isaiah, whose handsome beard, as he termed it, had collected icicles thick enough to qualify for status as a second chin, had taken to drying his boots by setting them inside a Dutch oven, an unorthodox solution that rendered all subsequent breads with a curious leather baguette aroma. Martha pretended not to notice. Sleeping in a covered wagon after a blizzard isn't exactly restful. It was less like drifting off to dreamland and more like attempting a nap in a chilly bread box full of your entire extended family, all of whom snore in various keys. Comfort was precious and strange. Someone's elbow in your ribs meant warmth. A drooling cousin at your shoulder meant shared body heat. A frozen biscuit stuck to your sock meant breakfast, technically, if you were patient. These small discomforts mingled with bigger worries. What had the snow buried? Where was the next creek? Would they lose another oxen to the deceptive charms of thin ice? Because if there's one thing nobody teaches you in Eastern drawing rooms, it's how confidently frozen water can lie. Still, spirits were high in the way only wagon-bound pioneers could muster during the 19th century. With just enough blind optimism and cold-induced delirium to confuse survival with adventure. Someone, likely young Henry with ears like soup spoons and a voice that cracked like winter bark, decided it was time to make music. Out came the fiddle, or more precisely, what was left of it. The rest had been fed to the fire 3 nights ago, but the remaining string and half-burned frame created a mournful sameness that perfectly captured the ambience of half-frozen socks and stew made mostly from hope. As Henry coaxed a few pitiful notes, the others closed their eyes and imagined grand concert halls. It's amazing what the imagination can do when your primary options are snow, beans, and talking to someone who collects button lint as a hobby. And speaking of button lint, dear old Uncle Silas finally awoke from his snoring meditative state, declaring, as he often did after prolonged silence, "The moon told me secrets again." Everyone nodded, not out of belief, but because active disagreement took energy they no longer had in abundance. Also, Uncle Silas was the only one who could reliably fix a cracked wagon wheel with nothing but wishbones and intimidation. The storm may have passed, but nature hadn't signed a peace treaty just yet. There were new noises now. In the distance, a soft tinkling, not of bells, but of ice shifting on tree, limbs snapping twigs with a dainty crackle like 100 tiny ballerinas dislocating ankles. Charles, ever the suspicious one, stared out the wagon flap. What he saw was both beautiful and unnerving. A herd of deer tiptoeing through the glassy landscape, steam puffing from their nostrils like they were small trains, switched permanently to stealth mode. They moved slowly, even reverently, as though they understood they were trespassing on the truce made between man and cold. "Wish we had their coats," Sarah muttered. "Wish we had their grace," came the reply. It was unclear who said it, but most suspects were asleep, or pretending. As the wagon shifted slightly with the settling snow, and the tiny fire in the tin stove coughed politely, the world outside began to fill with stars, each one blinking down through a sky scrubbed so clean it squeaked. The type of stars you'd happily accept as company if everyone else was snoring, which of course they were. Tomorrow would mean digging out wheels, warming hands, checking for frostbite, and discovering which foodstuffs had transformed into mysterious permafrost artifacts. But for now, there was only the quiet weight of warm breath and cold silence tangled gently in the air. The night deepened, curled inward like a cat, and the snow outside held its breath. And somewhere under that heavy woolen blanket of stars, something stirred in the ice, something that was not quite animal, not quite human, and only half interested in civilization. But that, dear dreamer, is a tale best whispered when the night grows just a touch deeper still. It was some time after the stew had cooled and the frost had found its way inside the sleeves of every man's coat that the wagons gave up, pretending they were any kind of shelter. The canvas tops, proud and white by day, now shivered like jelly in the night wind. The wind, for its part, was doing its very best impression of an offended banshee. And the snow, the snow, was no longer the soft flurry of a Christmas card. No, it had graduated into the kind of sideways blizzard that makes you suspect the sky might be angry. Inside one of the tents, which wasn't really a tent so much as a patched quilt, pretending to be one, a family of 5 lay bundled like onions in a basket, layered up with every scrap of clothing they owned. The father, known fondly by the wagon train as Elbow Dan, not due to any notable elbows, but because he had once described a mule's gait as an elbow in motion, was recounting a prairie ghost story to his shivering children, mostly as a distraction from how much their toes ached. And that, he whispered, wide-eyed, is why you never whistle facing into the wind on a new moon night, because that's when old Misty Hannah listens best. The littlest child, who had spectacularly large ears and an expression that seemed permanently surprised, whispered, "Papa, do you think Misty Hannah minds stew? Beans?" Dan considered that earnestly. One does not trifle with spectral culinary preferences in the frontier after all. He shook his head. "Only if you eat the last one. Ghosts mind poor manners more than anything." Outside, meanwhile, the oxen were huddled together as a single, soggy mass of resigned plodding poetry. Oxen, you see, are not gifted poets, but their gazes speak volumes about life's difficult truths. At the edge of the picket lines, the animals stood in formation like statues of Herculean despair, a phrase that was once used poetically in a pioneer diary and then never used again because nobody could spell Herculean correctly in the dark. There were murmurs that the snow might last another 3 days. The wagon master, old Ephraim, who was old mostly by appointment, being only 42 but deeply seasoned in the art of frowning, had announced earlier that this wouldn't be the worst of it, which few took as comfort. Ephraim had a confidence in barometric readings derived solely from how loudly his knees creaked. They were creaking like mad now, and so the wagons stayed still under a sky as dark as burnt molasses. The storm whispered and sometimes howled through the tall cottonwoods like a bored librarian testing new curse words. The fire was long out, the ashes tucked beneath a flat skillet, as if someone might wake up and decide to cook flapjacks using only hope. But not everyone was miserable. Mary Jane Butterfield, aged 11 and far too well read for her own chronological station, sat in her family's wagon, writing in her stitched-together journal with the precision of a fledgling novelist. Today's entry began. Day 37. Blizzard. I suspect we live full-time in Wyoming now, though no one will admit it. She paused to draw a tiny sketch of a horse whose eyes looked startled, as if it too had just been told they might be wintering in Wyoming. The snow fell thick and straight as candle wax, now layering the world in slow silence, tucking everything under a blanket that would forget it by morning. Still, every little patch of warmth, a glove passed hand to hand, a shared biscuit too hard to bite, a story told in half whispers, was evidence that the cold hadn't won yet. The land itself had gone quiet. No coyotes sang. Even the wind, perhaps satisfied it had made its point, had quieted down to a slow breath that feathered the walls of the wagons with a sleepy sigh. Someone far off began humming a hymn, badly but sincerely, which, in truth, is the only respectful way to hum a hymn around a campfire mostly made of frozen cow pies. And so, the night continued, not with terror nor with joy, but that rare kind of calm that only comes when there's absolutely nothing left to do but stay warm, stay quiet, and wait. Come morning, should the sky allow it, they would rise into a world reshaped by whiteness. But for now, in the hush between one storm and the next, they merely breathed, together. And in the hush that curled around the wagons like a quilt of time itself, the world leaned gently toward dawn. The snow had stopped some time before dawn, though the wind grumbled on like an old mule who didn't like the oats in his bucket. It scratched across the wagon's canvas cover, rattling the wooden hoops like a ghost, uncertain of the house rules. Inside, warmth hovered in patches, the little hearth of shared breath, the embering coals in the travelling stove, and the comforting weight of mutual survival. Tabitha blinked groggily into the pale light filtering through frost-ribboned seams. Her bonnet was halfway off her head, and someone's woolen stocking was laced around her ankle. Not hers, she was fairly certain, unless her foot had grown 2 sizes overnight and recently taken up wood chopping. The wagon creaked as someone sat up, a Mr. Cotton, whose snore could have measured wind speed if you held a feather next to it during the night. He grunted in vague victory, having made it to morning. That, on the trail, was sometimes enough to feel like winning a small, cold lottery. Outside, the world was glittering and silenced under inches of glimmering, uninvited fluff. The kind of snow that looked like sugar atop a pie, but bit like a frozen raccoon if you tried to walk through it in your socks, which, regrettably, someone had done. A solitary footprint led away from the wagons and looped questionably toward the latrine, before disappearing behind a drift that had swallowed something hat-shaped. Even the oxen were subdued, standing knee-deep in their own white prisons, chewing contemplatively. One stared directly at the cook fire with the infinite gaze of a beast who has seen things, like the tragic attempt to make sourdough biscuits on day 3 of the blizzard, when someone, we shall not name names, mistook ashes for flour. It was Tuesday, probably. Time had gone a bit soft around the edges during the storm. Pocket watches had frozen precisely at the moment they most needed to tick, and the sun, poor performer that she was this time of year, seemed uninterested in her contract to rise and set with any conviction. But now, in this blanketed world, there was a sort of holy stillness, the kind that makes you feel small and warm, and part of something wide and breathing, a flicker of gratitude caught in the chest, like fire catching on dry kindling, for the miracle of not being alone in the middle of nowhere, even if your closest companions included a man who argued with his own boots and a woman who believed the moon gave her hair its curl. Tabitha, wrapped cozily to her nose, watched as someone outside attempted valiantly to dig out a path to the water barrel. The snow reached up to their thighs. From inside the wagon, they looked like an inch-length toy soldier battling a loaf of whipped meringue, determined, baffled, and somehow philosophical about the whole endeavor. Yes, they grumbled. Yes, old Mr. Cotton loudly declared the pioneers should have brought sled dogs instead of oxen. And he was, staring at the oxen as he said it, which felt rude. But still, Something about weathering a storm with other stubborn hearts made it all feel manageable, even noble if you squinted. As pots began to rattle and smoke coiled from campfires once more, it became clear that the day's main ambition was find the axle grease, find the coffee, find the road, in that order. They'd been stalled for 3 days, and though the blizzard had painted the world beautiful, it had also turned socks to ice sculptures and butter into a brick that could stop bullets. Over breakfast, salt pork and something biscuit-like that might have once been cornbread. A child recited the Gettysburg Address from memory because she missed her school teacher. Someone played a harmonica, poorly. A man named Finn sneezed so hard he startled 2 hens out of their roost. The sun dared show a sliver of face, and for just a flicker of time, the prairie looked like the land before time, before maps, before fences. The snow would melt someday, tracks would resume. So too would debates about which was better, canned peaches or dried apples, and whether oxen could love. The wagon wheel would turn again. But on this morning, cocooned in the quiet hush that follows a howl, the settlers did not move quickly. They sat with their wooden bowls and their loud mittens and their frozen buttons. They laughed softly, cursed quietly, and waited for coffee, for courage, for the kind of sunlight that tells you it's safe to thaw. And somewhere in the snow, beneath the polished hush of blizzard's end, a dream was folding itself back into the blankets, ready for sleep again, just for a while longer.